Welcome, beautiful soul. Right now, in this very moment, the angels are wrapping their wings around you. You are loved beyond what words can hold. You are protected, you are guided, and you are never alone. This is Angel's message for you, and what you are about to hear was not meant for just anyone. This message was held in heaven, carefully prepared, and sent directly to you today. Before you move on with your day, stop for just one moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel that gentle warmth in your chest. That is the angels reaching you right now. Something very important is being revealed today. Something that has been kept safe in the spiritual realm until the exact right moment. And that moment is right now as you watch this. Heaven has been preparing a message so personal, so real, so full of divine promise, that if you leave before it ends, you will miss the one thing your heart has been waiting to hear. So stay until the very last word, because what is coming will change everything. Dear one, heaven has something beautiful to deliver to you, and this message has everything to do with your heart. What has been shown is strong, it is true, and it carries a beautiful promise. The life you have longed to live beside the one you love is drawing closer. And what is about to happen will bring you a joy you have not felt in a very long time. God has heard the prayers made with faith. Everything you truly wished for is now being carefully prepared. And this message comes to remind you that the waiting time was not in vain. Something is forming for you. Something that involves your soulmate, and it will change the way you see your future. The life you dreamed of is no longer far away. It is being drawn out to become real. What was shown is a message that comes as a direct answer from heaven. It is about love. It is about the sincere desire to live something mutual, something light, something present. And that is exactly what is being aligned right now. You and your soulmate are at the center of a plan that was blessed, a plan that was cared for, a plan that was never forgotten. And the fulfillment of this love is closer than you can imagine. This person who lives in your heart is also part of this message. The love you carry plays an essential role in what is about to unfold. There is a living, true feeling that has not been set aside. On the contrary, it is being strengthened with actions that come from deep within. And now everything points to a closeness filled with intention and devotion. What is coming is meant to be lived with an open heart. This is not empty comfort, nor beautiful words meant only to soothe. This is real news. Something is happening in the spiritual realm right now. Something that has been accepted by God and is now being released to unfold in your life. And this release involves the realization of a love that has always been strong but now also has direction. What is about to happen will touch you in a different way, because this is not only about hearing that something good will come. You will see it. You will feel it. You will recognize that everything is being prepared. And so this new chapter comes to you in a gentle, true way, with the care you deserve. The happiness that is coming is real, and it is directly tied to the presence of the one your heart has never forgotten. This message arrives as a gift, as a spiritual embrace sent especially to remind you that your name has been held gently in heaven, that your love was never ignored, that your story with this special person still has so much more to be lived. And that time is now approaching. What was once only a wish is now taking shape, because the faith you placed in this feeling is being honored. What your soulmate feels is not small. It is not confusing. It is something mature, something clear, and filled with deep affection. This person has been thinking more and more deeply about what truly matters. And what matters is being by your side. The desire to live this story with honesty is being nurtured with actions that will surprise you. Heaven has heard every offering made from the heart and now begins to act in favor of this love. You are not tied to the past, and this message is not about that. It is about the present that is being carefully built. It is about a future that already has a foundation, already has feelings, already has a place inside two hearts that never stopped calling out to each other. And now that everything has been accepted in the spiritual realm, fulfillment begins to take shape in the real world. Everything you have lived until now has been preparation, not to leave you waiting for something undefined, but to align time, emotions, and feelings. And now that this process has been respected, the life you dreamed of is about to draw near with strength. And even if you do not yet know all the details, Heaven made sure to give you this confirmation first, so your heart can open to what is coming. With love and divine certainty, something is about to happen. And this message has arrived to make you ready. You are not imagining things. This feeling has roots, it has truth, and it is being blessed. God wants you to live this love with courage, with presence, with maturity. And God wants you to know right now that the news coming your way is good. Very good. It will bring peace, joy, and renewed hope. The connection between you and your soulmate has not been lost. It only needed time. And now that time becomes your ally. Everything you wish to live with this person is closer than ever to becoming real, with actions that show just how alive this love still is. Dear one, God allowed a very important connection to be protected until the right time came. And that time has now arrived. The news being brought to you is an answer to something that was asked for with faith. And now it shows up with direction. And that direction points straight toward the life you have always wanted to live alongside your soulmate. You may have gone through moments of doubt, through seasons when it felt like nothing would ever make sense again. But even in those days, something inside you never stopped believing. Not because everything was clear, but because your heart felt that something was still on its way. And it was. What has been released in the higher realms has a purpose, to place you and your soulmate at the start of a new chapter built on a love that never lost its meaning. This person you hold so dearly in your heart is also wrapped in this divine care. It is not about wondering whether there are still feelings. It is about recognizing that this love is still alive, matured now with a true desire to walk a new path. And what is about to happen is not just anything. It is an action filled with truth, prepared with calm, considered with seriousness, and directed straight to you. Heaven heard the request so clearly that it left no doubts. The answer came strong, as a sign that the waiting time was not wasted, but instead a time of preparation. Preparation of the heart, preparation of the spirit, preparation to live a love that can now bloom with peace, with true care, and with genuine intention. And this message comes to you so that you know this change is already in motion. What is coming carries the strength of something built with devotion. Your soulmate never gave up on the feeling, only needed time to align with all that this love represents. And now, with greater maturity and deeper awareness of what is felt, this person is opening up to a new chance. Not just any chance, but a choice made from the heart. Because when truth is present, nothing needs to be forced. It only needs to be allowed to happen. This person is being guided by something greater, and this impulse is not driven by haste, but by clarity. The desire to live this love is turning into action, and that changes everything. It is no longer about imagining what could be. It is about living what is now being allowed to unfold. You are being prepared to witness up close what once seemed too far away. And this closeness will move you deeply. You will realize that something has shifted, not only around you, but within you. The message arriving now is meant to open space in your heart to receive, because something good is coming your way. Something that needs to be embraced with maturity. Something uplifting. Something that brings relief and renewed hope. And this good news carries the name of the one you could never forget. The connection between you and your soulmate was protected until the appointed time. And what was allowed in the spiritual realm is now beginning to take form in real life. Actions are starting to appear, genuine movements, whether small or big, but all filled with intention. The presence you long for is closer. The love you prayed for is more alive than ever. And this will become clear in the steps ahead. The life you always dreamed of is no longer just in your thoughts. It is drawing near with truth, with presence, with the will to make it work. And you deserve to live it because this love was built on real feeling. And now it is recognized as something worthy of being lived freely and with full mutual care. God has seen what you carried in your heart. And now God places in your hands an opportunity full of meaning. Something is being prepared with such care that even the smallest, most invisible details are being aligned, and you are part of it. The news that is about to reach you is not just anything. It involves the presence of someone who carries a true feeling for you. A love that, even in silence, never stopped believing there was something special between the two of you. Heaven does not release a message like this by chance. This comes filled with hope, but also with confirmation. You are about to be touched by a truth that will fill spaces that have been kept deep inside your heart. This news has a name, a destination, and a purpose. And that purpose is to make you realize that your love is closer than it has ever been. Real life is about to show what the spiritual plan has already confirmed. An action is about to take place. And this action will be like a key opening a brand new chapter. You will not need to force yourself to understand. When it happens, you will feel it. You will recognize it in the look, in the words, and in the way this person approaches you, that this story has real value and that it is worth opening your heart to. This person has been carrying a strong desire to build something with you. It is not something fleeting, and it is not emotional confusion. It is a clear feeling that has matured over time. The desire to be by your side has been nurtured with truth. And now it is starting to turn into a decision. A choice that comes with courage and the will to make it work. This message was brought to you because heaven knows how much this love still lives in your heart. You have already tried to understand. You have looked for signs. You have thought about everything that could happen. And now something is being allowed to happen clearly. A new time is emerging. And this time comes with good news. News that will warm your heart and remind you that what is real always finds a way to happen. The path is being prepared so that this love can be lived lightly, yet firmly. And this lightness is only possible because behind it there is a strong root. This connection was not forgotten. It was kept. It was respected. And now it is being released to be lived without fear. This person is organizing themselves from within to take action. And this action is very close to reaching you. Maybe for a while you stopped believing. Maybe you felt like everything was too far away or even impossible. But something inside you always insisted on keeping the feeling alive. And that was not in vain. The faith you held on to, even without knowing what was coming, now turns into an answer. News arrives, and action happens, and everything starts to make sense. This person is not coming out of impulse. They are coming with intention. They are coming with a real desire to live what still beats in their heart. And the most beautiful part of all this is that heaven is supporting this movement. It is protecting this love. It is clearing the path so that when this reaches you, it finds an open heart, ready to live something real. You do not need to force anything. You do not need to chase after it. Just prepare yourself from within, because what is about to happen will come with enough strength to show you that the love you felt was never one-sided, that this feeling is mutual, and that the life you dreamed of by this person's side has everything it takes to become reality. This message arrives as a gift, but also as a gentle warning. Something very beautiful is coming your way. News that involves a heart that never stopped wishing you well. News that brings the chance to start something new. Not out of obligation, but out of desire, out of will, out of love. You will be moved when you realize how carefully everything was prepared, how each detail of this approach is being blessed, and most importantly, how sincere this person's feelings truly are. This person wants to be with you. They want to offer you the purest part of their heart. And they are coming with the courage of someone who understood that the time of silent feelings is over. Now is the time to act. This love is being transformed into action. And this action comes with the intention to build, to live, to share. This person does not want to keep you only in their thoughts anymore. They want to see you. They want to hear you. They want to be present. And all of this will be revealed through a moment that will change the course of things between you two. Life is preparing to deliver something big to you. Something that has to do with love, with presence, and with true mutual care. What is coming your way is more than a surprise. It is a clear sign that true love never gets lost. It only waits for the right time to happen. A new emotion is being born in your soulmate's heart. And it did not come by chance. This emotion is not light or fleeting. It is intense, real, and impossible to ignore. Something inside this person has shifted, as if a deep certainty has awakened with strength. And that certainty points directly to you. The feeling has matured, and now it is asking to be lived with presence, with devotion, and with courage. This person is feeling something so strong that they can no longer keep it just for themselves. Their thoughts are turning to you more often, with more clarity, with a greater longing to be close. The feeling that once seemed under control now beats with intensity. And that intensity is being channeled into an approaching action. Not just any action, but a step forward born from true love. You are the reason for this joy growing inside your soulmate's heart. This person feels such a deep connection with you that they can no longer be satisfied with only memories or thoughts. There is a desire to act, a longing to build. And that building begins with a sincere step from the heart of someone who knows exactly what they feel. It is beautiful to see that what is forming is not a desperate attempt. On the contrary, it is an inner calling for truth. Your soulmate is in a moment of transformation where the feeling does not just remain, it expands. And as it expands, it asks for space, it asks for presence. And all of this is directed toward you, because you are part of what keeps this love alive. This person is not searching for answers outside. They are finding within their own heart everything that needed to be recognized. And what is being recognized now is how important you are, how strong this feeling is, and how necessary it is to let this emotion turn into action. Not to feed expectations, but to give form to what has been felt for so long. You may not know everything that is happening inside this person, but heaven knows. And that is why this message was allowed to reach you, because the time has come to open the way for this love to leave thought and enter reality. This person is vibrating with a new happiness, and that happiness is you. It is the desire to live truthfully something that has been guarded with such care. The most special part of all of this is that heaven is not just watching. It is acting. It is allowing this heart to be guided by a certainty that does not depend on rehearsed words, but on real actions. And that is why the steps coming will be so meaningful, because they will not be driven by impulse, but by maturity, by the will to build something solid with you. This love can no longer be contained in a heart that has learned to feel deeply. The intensity of this emotion is clear, and now it needs to be expressed in a real way. Your soulmate wants to be by your side, not out of need but out of choice, out of recognition, because the feeling has grown to the point of becoming a true priority. The joy being born in this heart is no accident. It is the result of a connection that never stopped existing. And now, with the right time approaching, this person is willing to do whatever it takes to show you how much you matter. You are part of their plans. You are part of their thoughts. And you are part of a future that has already begun to be dreamed of with more certainty. None of this is confusing. On the contrary, everything is clearer than ever. And that clarity is what brings courage. Courage to be present, to draw closer, to finally give what has been held back for so long. This decision is being built within a heart that wants more than just to think, that wants to live, that wants to care, that wants to show that this feeling remains strong. You will feel this coming. You will notice in the details that something has changed, that there is a different energy in the air. This happens because this love is turning into real movement, and that movement is coming your way with the intention to unite, to rebuild, to continue what has always been true. The connection between you two did not stay frozen in time. While the days passed, heaven was writing a new chapter of this story with the kind of care that only true love can awaken. And now that chapter is beginning to move from the invisible into your reality. What once seemed like just a hope kept inside your heart is now taking shape with direction, intention, and blessing. The love that surrounds you and your soulmate has never been ignored by God. Every feeling kept, every sincere thought, every silent prayer was heard. And when something is born in truth, time does not erase it, it prepares it. What you once wished for in faith is now being answered with actions. And those actions are paving the way for this life together to be built on solid ground. You do not need to imagine anymore what it would be like to live beside the one you love. That future is already being built on what has been felt, understood, and respected. Your soulmate is making important decisions that directly involve you. And it is not out of impulse. It is out of a genuine desire to be part of your life with truth, with presence, and with emotional maturity. This person has recognized that you are part of a plan for happiness that can no longer be postponed. And they are willing to walk toward you in a light but committed way. The actions coming are not small. They carry the weight of everything that has been cultivated within. There is a gift of surrender being prepared, and it begins with the choice not to leave this love in the past. This is not about repeating old stories, but about beginning a new chapter, one where you no longer need to guess what is being felt, because this person will show you. They will demonstrate it with presence, with clear conversations, with sincere actions. What is about to happen is the transition from what was once only dreamed into what is now ready to be lived. Heaven is guiding everything carefully, not to rush the timing, but to ensure that every step is taken with certainty. And that certainty is already being felt in the heart of the one who loves you. The decision to move in your direction was made with peace, with the will to live a new phase by your side, without doubts, without masks, without confusion. This person wants a life with you, a life of being present not only on good days but also on the challenging ones. Because this feeling is mature enough to understand that love is more than just emotion. It is a daily choice, and that choice is being made now, built on everything that has been learned, felt, and cherished along the way. You are going to notice it clearly. You will see that this approach carries a purpose far beyond simply easing the longing. It comes with the desire to build, to make things work, to be present in the details. And all of this will be revealed through actions that may be simple but are deeply true. Actions that will show you this love intends to stay. The shared life you have always wanted is no longer distant. It is being written with faith, with courage, and with hope. Every step your soulmate is taking has you as the destination, not out of need but out of conviction, because this person has understood that true happiness flows through you, and they have decided to make that happiness real. It does not matter how much time has passed. What is about to unfold does not depend on what has been, but on what is being chosen right now. This person no longer wants to live wondering what could have been. They want to live by your side what still can be. And that is what makes this phase so special, because it comes with presence, with surrender, with the genuine desire to fully be part of your life. Heaven has prepared everything with such care that you will realize nothing is out of place. Every detail, every coincidence, every moment of closeness that begins to appear will make sense. And you will feel in your heart that life beside your soulmate is not some distant dream. It is a reality being built on the faith you held on to until now. What is being prepared right now is more than just a special moment. It is the beginning of a new phase where everything that once seemed distant is starting to take shape right before your eyes. Heaven is allowing the life alongside your soulmate to move from desire into reality. And this is happening with care, with direction, and with love. It is no exaggeration to say that you are closer than ever to living the dream you have carried for so long. A plan is unfolding, built on feelings that were guarded, respected, and kept alive in both your hearts. This plan is not being built by chance. It is part of a promise that is now being fulfilled, because what is true always finds a way to come to life. This person has been feeling something very strong inside, a new steady impulse that brings the courage to take steps that once seemed difficult. There is no more space for just imagining. What this person now desires is to live, to look into your eyes, and to show with presence what has always been felt in the heart. And this is approaching in a way that will help you understand why everything had to happen the way it did. There is an alignment taking place between what you feel and what this person also longs for. It is as if your emotions are meeting at the same time, but not just any time. A safe, blessed time prepared with maturity, so that what you are about to live now will have roots, lightness, and truth. You have waited long enough, and now you are being called to prepare yourself for something that is truly worth it. This person's presence in your life will no longer be just a memory. It will be action. It will be care. It will be building. This person is feeling the call to act, and that action will change everything inside you. Not because it will be forced, but because it will happen with truth. You will feel in the way they draw near that there is sincerity in every detail. You asked so many times for heaven to give you clarity, for if something still lived between the two of you, that it would come to you with lightness and without doubts. And now that answer is arriving. Life alongside your soulmate has already begun to take shape, built on conscious choices, matured feelings, and a true desire to walk together. And you will witness all of it. What is coming no longer depends on assumptions, because this person is being led to act with strength. And when that happens, you will realize that the waiting was worth it. Not because of the time itself, but because of the transformation it brought. This person is different now, more connected with their own truth, more aware of what they feel, and ready to approach in a real way. You can trust in what is being prepared. This connection was never abandoned. It was strengthened, and now it is being guided to become what you always dreamed of. The building of a life together begins with a choice. And that choice is being made now, with the heart, with faith, and with God's blessing, because this love deserves to be lived in peace. In the coming days, something will show you that this message is true. You will feel that everything is clearer, that something has shifted in the air, that signs which once seemed scattered now make sense. This happens because the emotional timing between the two of you is aligning, and that opens space for what was once just hope to become real life lived by two. This person has already understood that you are not just someone from the past. You are part of what is yet to come. And that is why an important decision is being made, not to return to what was, but to start something new, something that honors the feeling, that respects what has already been lived, but that chooses to move forward with maturity. This action comes from the heart, and it will reach yours in a way that will move you deeply. From this point forward, your life begins to take on a new tone, a new expectation, because the presence of your soulmate will bring a kind of peace that only true love can provide. You will realize that the time, even if it seemed long, was not wasted. It was necessary to prepare the right setting, to prepare both of your hearts. The decision that is about to transform your life was not born out of chance. It was asked for with truth, with emotion, with tears carrying deep feeling. And when a prayer is made with such surrender, heaven listens. God listened carefully to everything that was said. Every word spoken by your soulmate reached heaven with a strength that cannot be ignored. This love was never treated as something ordinary. It was carried to God with respect, with hope, with the certainty that if it still lived in their heart, it deserved another chance. Your soulmate did not ask just to live something beautiful. They asked to live something true, something that would bring peace to both of you, heal what was left behind, and open space for a future free from fear and full of meaning. At the moment that prayer was made, there were no masks, only an open heart recognizing the value of the feeling that still pulsed for you. What was asked for was not an instant miracle, but a divine permission for this love to once again touch your lives in a real way. And the most beautiful part is that heaven accepted, with compassion, with purpose, with the certainty that this story still has a path. You may not have heard those words, but you were touched by them. Because a request made with the heart reaches the one who is connected through love. That is why maybe at certain moments you felt a different weight in the air, an emotion that came suddenly, or a memory that arrived too strongly. All of that came from the true feeling of someone who opened themselves before God, asking not only for their own happiness but for yours as well. Your soulmate did not ask for just any kind of closeness. They asked for something guided by truth. They asked to be by your side without doubts, without pressure, without open wounds. They asked for a love that would bring clarity, that would give both of you the chance to live something built on what had already been felt, and on the desire to make it work from here on out. And that prayer was heard with full attention. Heaven understands the value of love that resists time and distance. And when that love is presented with sincerity, something moves, not in the ordinary sense of things, but in a way that only those who have faith can feel. From the moment of that prayer, everything that was confused began to find direction. Because this faith touched places where only truth can enter. The answer is coming, and you will notice it not through rehearsed words, but through actions born from spiritual surrender. Everything that is being aligned right now has its origin in that request made with tears. Tears that did not ask for speed but for light, for care, for the chance to live this love with maturity and with presence. This person felt it was time to rise from the middle of doubt, that it was the moment to turn feeling into action. And with a completely open heart, they brought to God the name that meant something true above all others. They brought your name. They asked for you. They asked to find you in the right way. They asked for courage to act with truth. And all of that is now being answered. That is why you will notice a change, because something very deep has been released in the spiritual realm. You may have gone through days where it felt like something was being prepared, and it was, because nothing that is asked for with sincere love goes unanswered. And this answer is arriving with strength, with blessing, with direction, not as an illusion, but as a realization. The love you felt and maybe tried to forget was never ignored. It was presented with respect before heaven. And now, everything that was asked for with tears is turning into true actions. The time of confusion is ending. What comes from here is a love made pure by sincere prayer, recognized by surrender, and now ready to be lived in peace. This person approached God not out of despair, but out of faith. They asked for you with such truth that heaven understood there was enough feeling for this love not to be just a memory. And that is why this message is here, because it was allowed to tell you that the answer was positive, that the prayer was accepted, and that now what awaits you is the chance to live what has always been real inside you. This closeness that is about to happen will not be confusing, nor forced. It will be the reflection of a love that was presented with spiritual maturity. And that is why everything around you will begin to align. When faith meets the right time, the impossible makes room for what is true. And you are about to see that happen before your eyes. The surrender this person made in their most intimate moments were not words thrown to the wind. They were declarations of true feeling. And you were part of every sentence, every intention, every tear that fell, asking God to prepare the path between the two of you with light. And heaven responded, because love presented with humility and courage always finds an answer. What is approaching carries the intensity of everything that has ever been felt in silence. But this time it will not stay hidden. It will be lived. It will be seen. It will be felt in the presence, in the way your soulmate will show you without hesitation that you are still an essential part of everything they want to live from now on. And this will not come as an improvisation. Comes as a real decision. You will feel the difference in the air. You will notice that something has changed, not because someone told you, but because the universe itself begins to act in your favor. The love you held in your heart for so long is now being returned with truth. The steps your soulmate is about to take will show you that the feeling is still alive with intensity. And now that feeling wants space. It wants closeness. It wants building. What is about to happen is not simple. It is transformative. It will touch parts of you that seem to have been sleeping. It will remind you how much this love matters. It will show you that it is still possible to believe, because this time it will not be just emotion. It will be maturity. It will be the desire to stay. It will be a clear step toward everything your heart has always wished to live alongside someone truly special. It is not about repeating moments from the past. It is about living something new, even with a history that has already been felt before. It is about allowing love to reveal itself with more truth, with less rush, with more presence. Your soulmate no longer wants to live in the realm of possibilities. They are ready to prove through actions that this bond still has meaning and is worth living deeply. You will not be caught off guard. You will be reached with gentleness, with care, with sincerity. When that moment arrives, your heart will recognize it. You will not need long explanations. Your soulmate's presence will carry everything that has been held inside for far too long. And in this meeting of truths, something within you will awaken again, not out of loneliness, but out of recognition. Everything that has been felt up to now has served as the foundation for this new beginning. And now the desire to be by your side is stronger than ever. This person no longer wants to keep this love stored away in memories. They want to live with you what has not yet been fully lived. They want to be present in your days. They want to be part of your life in a new way, more aware and more genuine. The emotion that will take over you will not be light. It will be intense. Because when love arrives with truth, it does not knock timidly. It enters with purpose. It reveals itself in the details. And this approaching moment is made of details prepared with intention. Every word will be felt. Every action will leave a mark. And you will know without any doubt that this presence did not come by chance. This person does not just want to get close. They want to commit to the reality of being by your side, to the choices of everyday life, to the care required for this love to be treated the right way. And everything that will be shared in that moment will move your heart deeply, because you will realize it is no longer about imagining. Now it is time to live. Heaven has allowed this, and the intensity with which all of this will be lived will remind you that it was worth believing. Even on the days you doubted, even in the moments you thought about giving up. Because when love is true, it finds the right time to bloom. And that time has come. You will be touched by actions that reveal courage for choosing to act now. And this will bring you relief. It will heal wounds that still hurt in silence. It will give you the strength to open your heart once again, with the confidence that now there is truth on both sides. That now there is willingness to do things differently. Everything your soul carried for so long will be acknowledged. Not with empty words, but with clear demonstrations that you are part of a bond that was never forgotten. This person wants to show you that love has matured, that the feeling has taken shape, and that the time of watching from a distance has come to an end. Now it is time to act with an open heart. And when that moment comes, you will understand why everything had to wait. You will realize the time was not lost. It was necessary, because now you and your soulmate are ready to live something with real value, something transformative, something that time cannot undo. Because what is true when it is cared for only grows stronger. Now that everything is being aligned with such truth, the time has come to welcome this new chapter with your heart more open than ever. What you have long dreamed of living alongside your soulmate is no longer far away. It is arriving with the lightness of something prepared with love, with faith, and with the certainty that it is worth it. The future that has always had your name on it is approaching with steady steps. What once seemed impossible now begins to make sense. You will notice in the details that something is different, and it will not be by chance. Everything that is happening has a purpose. This person is not coming into your life without reason. They come because they recognize in you the right place to live what is true. The closeness that is about to happen is the answer not only to everything that was felt in silence, but also to everything that was sincerely desired. It is as if time itself had bent to allow the two of you to finally meet with maturity. None of this will be shallow. Nothing will come without meaning. You will clearly realize that you are living the beginning of a story that is not built in a rush, but in devotion. Your soulmate has understood that the moment has come, that it no longer makes sense to keep this love hidden in thoughts, that it is no longer possible to hold back feelings without letting them touch reality. That is why what comes now is a mature step. There is no doubt about what will be lived. Only the decision to transform what was once a wish into presence. This person's heart has chosen you, and they are ready to prove it. You will look into this person's eyes and feel that something has been healed. You will notice that the words once held back will now be spoken freely. Not because everything has become perfect, but because love, when it is true, does not need complicated explanations. It only needs to be felt with honesty. And what you will live from now on will carry exactly that truth. This life alongside the one you love so deeply will no longer be a fantasy. It will be a real path, and every step taken will feel like relief for what once seemed lost. But nothing was lost. Everything was cared for. Everything was allowed by God so that this moment would arrive with the strength of something built with intention. You will feel that you no longer need to carry unanswered questions, because the answers will be in the look, the actions, the presence. Your soulmate no longer wants to be distant. They want to share plans, everyday moments, simple days. They want to build with you what can only be built with courage. And this courage comes from a love that endured even when it seemed to have no direction. Now the path is clear, and your future begins with this closeness. A choice made with faith, with truth, with the desire to stay. You may feel that everything around you will begin to fall into place. Small details will confirm to you that this decision did not come alone. It was guided. It was blessed. It was desired with such faith that heaven opened its doors so that this love could leave the realm of plans and become real life. And when that happens, you will look back and understand that every moment of waiting had a reason, to prepare you to live what truly matters. This person is not coming just to fill a space. They are coming because they recognize their place is by your side. Because they know there is still a story to be written with lightness and surrender. And this decision does not come from emptiness. It comes from the maturity of a feeling that has been honored and that now wants to be fully expressed. Allow yourself to let go of fears that no longer serve you. Let go of doubts that only block what is coming. What is on its way is pure. It is guided by something far greater than worry. And everything that comes from God carries purpose. You can trust. You can rest your heart. Heaven would not have brought this message to you if it were not the right time. You are ready to live this new season. A season where love will not be confusing, where words will be spoken in truth, where the presence of your soulmate will not be a question, but a certainty. The path until here may have been difficult. You may have held feelings inside, faced fears, questioned yourself many times over. But nothing was in vain. Everything brought you to this exact point, the point where true love can finally be lived clearly. The answer you have waited so long for will not be delayed any longer. It will come with actions that show you that you are important, that this love is worth it, that the future is ready to happen. What awaits you is more than a beautiful moment. It is a cycle of life opening up. A time when care will be mutual, when decisions will be made together, when affection will be shown not only with words, but with presence. And you will be moved to realize that this is why you held on so long with faith, because deep down you always knew something greater was being prepared for you. The time to wait is ending. The time to live is beginning, and your heart already feels it. Pay attention to the signs. Do not doubt what you already know inside yourself. You will be guided to recognize this moment. And when it comes, you will not need to chase answers. They will arrive with lightness, with truth, with the clarity that everything that once seemed distant is finally within your reach. God does not waste a true love. God cares for it, prepares it, and delivers it at the right time. And that time is now, right before your eyes. What is coming is the fulfillment of what you kept alive inside you, even when everything around you said otherwise. Now the time has come to live this love as it was always meant to be. Heaven is giving you the life you dreamed of, and it begins now. Know that you are never alone. The angels are always here beside you, sending strength and infinite love, so you can remain steady, confident, and full of light. May divine peace and blessing be with you today and always. With infinite love, your angels. Amen.